We have already seen that considerable labor is required to prepare fuel, as a good fire in America is essential during the winter season. The frosts are intensely keen. A wide river is sometimes iced over in a single night, so as to be unnavigable. Everything of a fluid nature, exposed to the weather, is formed into a solid. For 2 or 3 months, the milk freezing as soon as is taken from the cows affords no cream, consequently no butter. It nevertheless is possible to obtain butter by keeping the churn near the fire and churning cream and milk both together, but as this method is exceedingly troublesome, it is seldom practiced. The nights in winter are at once inexpressibly cold and poetically fine. The sky is almost invariably clear, and the stars shine with a brilliancy entirely unknown in the humid atmosphere of England. Cold as it was, often did I, during the first winter, stand at the door of our cabin, admiring their luster and listening to the wolves, whose howling among the leafless woods at this season are almost unceasing. These animals are numerous in America, and unless the sheep be regularly folded, their depredations are extensively injurious, as they lacerate the throats of nearly all the flock. Sometimes also they will seize young pigs, but as they fear the old ones, unless they are impelled by hunger, these animals are not in much danger. The timid submissive sheep are always their favorite prey. The reader will perceive we had not much intercourse with the rest of the world. For a while no one seemed to notice us, except Mr. B., our neighbor Mr. Paddock, and one Mr. Burns, who lived about 2 miles off. All are misters in America. But indeed, the villainous conduct of Mr. Brevet had made us so suspicious that we scarcely knew whether to wish for an increased circle of acquaintance or entire seclusion. One thing was very afflictive, our being deprived of Christian Sabbath ordinances. We always honored that day by abstaining from our accustomed labor. We read our Bible and meditated therein. But Sabbath after Sabbath passed away without our once being able to assemble with those who keep holy day, or in the great congregation to unite our tribute of praise with the aspirations of those whose sentiments are, "How amiable are thy tabernacles, O Lord of hosts." At this time we were 5 miles from any place where public worship was regularly conducted. Subsequently, preaching houses much nearer were opened, the character of which will be noticed in its proper place. The motives which occasioned this work to be written require that a strict regard to truth be maintained, and in matters of fact, that nothing be introduced calculated to mislead, either by deterring or alluring. This rule has hitherto been carefully observed. Am I then asked if we thus far were satisfied with the step we had taken? My answer is, we regretted it very much. We had indeed plenty of cornbread and milk, but neither beer nor tea. Coffee was our chief beverage, which we used very sparingly for want of money. All the water we wanted we had to thaw, and during the nights, on account of the severe frost, we were very cold indeed, although we always kept the fire burning. Our bedclothes we had taken with us from England, and we were unable to procure any more, as they were dear, and our means almost exhausted. We had indeed some good land, but it was nearly all uncultivated, and we had nothing to sell except our cattle, which we wanted. The only ground of hope we had was in our industry and perseverance. My husband worked very hard. The little time we had to spare after feeding the cattle and procuring fuel was spent in splitting trees to make rails. All the fences here are made of rails. There are no thorns in the neighborhood. The method of fencing is peculiar. They use no post, but having prepared their rails, they lay one down on the ground where they wish to make a fence, not precisely in the same direction as the line of their intended fence, but making a small angle with it. Another rail is then laid down, with its end overreaching the first, with which it forms a cross like the letter X, only instead of the crossing being at the center, it is near the end of each rail. A third is then made to cross the second as before, and so on to an indefinite length. On each side of these several crossings a stake is driven into the ground to prevent their being removed. Other rails are then placed upon these, crossing each other in a similar manner till the fence is as high as it is required. Generally they are about 9 rails high. From the description here given, the reader will perceive that the fences are not straight as in England, but in a continued zigzag. The reason for this difference is timber and land are of comparatively little value in America, while their method requires less labor than ours. In this manner, we spent our first winter. We had plenty of work. Our amusements even tended to advantage. Great numbers of quails frequented our homestead to feed on our small stock of Indian corn. We caught several of them with snares, which were excellent eating. My husband also shot a few rabbits, of which there are vast numbers in America. We likewise saw several deer, but as we had no rifle, we could not kill any. We observed several kinds of birds, which we had not before seen. One in particular, which we took to be a species of turkey, engaged our attention. My husband tried several times to kill one, without effect. One Saturday, however, he was successful, and brought home his game with as much apparent consciousness of triumph as if he had slain some champion hydra of the forest. The following day we expected Mr. B., who by this time had received his money, to dine with us. We accordingly dressed our bird, and congratulated ourselves with the idea of having our countrymen to dine with us on a fine boiled turkey. Sunday morning arrived, and in due time our turkey was in the pot boiling for dinner. Mr. B. came. We told him how happy we were on account of the treat we were going to give him. He was surprised at our story, as those birds are difficult to obtain with a common fowling piece, and desired to see the feet and head. But the moment he saw them, he exclaimed, "It's a buzzard," a bird which, we subsequently learnt, gormandizes any kind of filth or carrion, and consequently is not fit to be eaten. We were sorely disappointed. Our turkey was hoisted into the yard, and we were obliged to be contented with a little bacon and a coarse Indian pudding, for which our stomachs were not altogether unprepared, although recently in anticipation of more sumptuous fare. The reader may think we were stupid not to know a turkey. The bird in question is very much like one, and indeed on that account is called in Illinois a turkey buzzard. As spring approached, we felt some symptoms of these hopes which had animated us in England with reference to our success as emigrants. Man's career in perspective is always brilliant, and it is providentially ordered that it should be so. Could we have foreseen our destiny, the prospect would have thrown us into despair. It would have robbed us of that present enjoyment and unfitted our minds for the difficulties with which we had to struggle. I am, however, anticipating my history. The symptoms to which I referred originated with the idea of being the cultivators of our own land. How these prospects were realized, the sequel will explain. By the beginning of March, our Indian corn was done, and it had served so long only through the greatest care. There was, however, by this time a little fresh grass in the woods, to which we were very glad to turn our little stock, consisting, as before stated, of a cow and calf, and a mare near foaling. As this method of summering cattle in America is peculiar to that country and affords to the farmer considerable advantages, I shall endeavor to be explicit in the account of it which I am about to give. I must then premise that all unenclosed lands, whether purchased of government or otherwise, are considered common pasturage. And as there are in Illinois thousands of acres in that state, any person can keep as many cattle during summer as he chooses. They are turned out at spring and thus run where they please. A person unacquainted with these habits would naturally be afraid of losing them in such immeasurable regions. This, however, seldom happens. There are few animals having a sufficiency of food that are fond of ranging over strange domains. Even in this country we observe foxes and hares to have their favorite haunts, from which it is difficult to break them. Domesticated animals manifest this principle of attachment still more strongly. Hence, no American farmer having his cattle on the range would fear being able to find them in a few hours, and indeed a person unacquainted with the haunts of any certain herd would most probably go directly towards them. Rivers and smaller streams have certainly some confining influence, but independent of that, their habits are to frequent those situations only to which they have been accustomed. In that country, cattle have a great liking for salt, and indeed it seems essential to their health, particularly in summer. An English farmer would smile to see a herd of cattle contending with each other over a few handfuls of dry salt, which had been thrown on the floor for them. This is seen every day in America. The milch cows require more of it than the rest, and unless they are regularly served with it, their milk becomes unpleasant. This induces them to come to their stand to be milked twice a day. Oxen and heifers will take no harm if they have a little twice a week, or even not so often. Where so many different herds of cattle run at large, there is a greater danger of them intermixing than of their being lost. To prevent this, great care is taken by each grazier at the spring to mark his own. Some cut their ears in various ways. Others burn certain marks on their horns with a hot iron. There is not, however, much confusion. The cattle which have been fed together during winter most generally associate with each other in summer, all having an unaccountable attachment to the master beast of the herd, apparently considering his presence a source of protection or honor. For this reason, the owner usually suspends a bell around this animal's neck, which enables him to find his cattle with greater ease. Hence the phrase, "bear the bell," is common even in this country. In this manner the cattle graze during summer, and when the pasturage fails, they cease to range, but besetting their master's cabin with incessant lowings remind him that winter is approaching, and that their claims to his bounty deserve attention and must have it. At this time, if any strange cattle have joined the herd, the law requires that the farmer cause them to be valued and their mark to be taken down and sent to 4 of the nearest mills for publicity. If they are not owned within a year, they belong to the herd. I must now leave our small herd of cattle running in the woods to acquaint the reader with our first summer's performances and success. The first fruits of our industry were derived from our sugar orchard, the care of which devolved principally on me. We were in want of nearly all kinds of implements of husbandry, without the means of procuring them, except by running into debt, a practice which we felt reluctant to adopt. Our sugar trees therefore at this time afforded us a seasonable boon. The weather was favorable, and by hard working we made nearly 300 weight, besides a barrel of molasses. We disposed of the greater part of it to a storekeeper named Mr. Varley at a rate of 7 or 8 cents per pound. It must not be understood that we got money for it. Business is seldom transacted after that manner in Illinois. My meaning is that we were allowed to take anything we wanted from the store by paying for it with sugar at the above rate. Our first care was to have some Indian corn for seed, and some more meal for our own use, which at that time we wanted. We likewise obtained a little coffee, 2 or 3 hoes, and a Yankee axe, which is much larger and broader than the one used in this country, and better adapted for the everyday business of hewing large blocks of timber for fuel and other purposes. And now, kind reader, if thou hast any intentions of being an emigrant, I cordially wish thee success. But before thou forsakest the endearments of thy present home, consider the situation in which we were placed with a helpless family dependent upon us. Thou hast seen us expend our little money with the utmost frugality. Thou art acquainted with our possessions, real and personal. It was now the middle of March, when Indian corn, the most useful produce of that country, must be sown, or the season would be past. We had land and seed, but no plow, nor any team, except an old mare that we feared would scarcely live while she foaled, and consequently we could not yoke her. What could we do? If we did not sow, we could not reap. We should have nothing to feed our cattle with the ensuing winter. Labor omnia vincit was our motto. We set to work with our hoes, I, husband, and son, the latter under 10 years of age, and day after day, for 3 successive weeks, did we toil with unwearied diligence till we had sown and covered in nearly 4 acres. We should probably have sown more, had not the rains which fall in torrents at this season prevented us. Whilst referring to the weather, it will be proper to observe that during the month of April in Illinois, a great quantity of rain usually falls, accompanied almost invariably with thunderstorms of a most awful character. A person who has lived only in England can have but an imperfect conception of these electrical phenomena. They happen most frequently in the night, which considerably increases their power of striking terror through the most intrepid bosom. The weather is at this time close and sultry, and as the sun declines, the sky becomes gradually overcast. Midnight arrives, a pitchy darkness overhangs the earth. By and by the wind begins to roar in the trees, and the hoarse thunder in the distance announces the coming of the storm. As it approaches, the thunderclaps wax louder and louder, while the lightning begins to play across the gloomy firmament in a most awful and terrific manner. Every moment the voice of the thunder acquires additional compass, never ceasing even for a moment, but before one peal has well broken on the ear, it is drowned by another still, more tremendous and loud. The lightning is even more overpowering than the thunder. One moment all is in obscurity. A second the heavens seemed rent asunder, the bright blue lightning dancing in all directions with a frightful and deadly velocity. Meanwhile the rain descends in torrents, threatening to sweep away the foundation of the dwelling. The length of time these storms continue is generally about an hour. The first I witnessed made an impression on my mind that will never be forgotten. My senses were completely disordered. I became alarmed at the slightest noise, and for a while felt more afraid of a thunderstorm than of any calamity which appeared in the power of misfortune to inflict upon me. Probably my late anxieties and bereavement preying on my mind had indisposed my nerves for such phenomena, at once terrific, awful, and sublime. But whatever was the cause, I have great pleasure in stating that I soon got the better of my timidity. Trees have frequently been struck near our house, but hitherto no accident has befallen us. We now consider these storms rather as annoying than dangerous. One reason, perhaps, is that the dry log house is a bad conductor of the electric fluid. About this time we were sorely tormented with another scourge, which, unlike the one just noticed, possessed exceedingly little of poetical or sublime character. It certainly operated on the nerves powerfully enough, but that in a manner rather calculated to move the lower than the more elevated passions of our nature. I refer to the mosquitoes, swarms of which infest that country during spring and autumn, much to the annoyance of its inhabitants. This troublesome insect is not unlike the gnat, which in this country so often terminates its existence by flying into the candle. Its bite is slightly venomous, causing small blisters somewhat like those occasioned by the sting of a nettle, only the pain attending it is more acute. They are the most numerous in low situations, or among thick woods where the heat is less oppressive. This insect cannot bear great heat, and on that account is never seen during the hottest weather except in very shady places. It is always most troublesome in the nights, and as it makes a constant humming when it flies, it is most noisy as well as a most unwelcome guest in a lodging-room. I do assure the reader I have lain for hours together with a handkerchief in my hand, fanning them from my face, when a little sleep would have been more seasonable relaxation. Various methods are practiced to drive them off or avoid them. We frequently made a fire at the door, which we covered with green leaves to make as much smoke as possible, and thereby to banish them from the neighborhood. But the moment the smoke was dissipated, they again made their appearance as numerous as flies in England on a summer day. Many persons make what are termed mosquito hangings for their beds. These are constructed of laths strung together so closely as not to allow a space for them to pass through. They seldom are seen on the prairies, or indeed in any place remote from thick shady woods. Thus some of our neighbors have been quite free from them, while we were tortured incessantly. We, however, had the advantage of being near fuel, a consideration of great importance in that country, especially as the soil of woodland is always more valuable than that of the prairies, and when cleared is likewise free from mosquitoes. Having referred to the prairies, it may be perhaps necessary to be a little more explicit. Many persons in England have a wrong idea of the uncultivated lands in America, imagining they are all wood. This is by no means the case. In Illinois there are thousands of acres with not a tree upon it, but covered with a sort of strong wild grass, growing sometimes 3 or 4 feet high. These lands are termed prairies and require only to be broken up with a prairie plow, and they become at once fine arable land. As I before intimated, this kind of land, though the soonest cultivated, is not the most productive, being, as the farmers term it, of a stronger quality than the other. The soil of both prairies and woodland is quite black, probably owing to the vegetable matter, which for ages has decayed thereon. At the season of the year now under notice, these prairies present to the eye a most charming appearance. Let the reader imagine himself by the side of a rich meadow, or fine grass plain, several miles in diameter, decked with myriads of flowers of a most gorgeous and varied description, and he will have before his mind a pretty correct representation of one of these prairies. Nothing can surpass in richness or color, or beauty or formation many of the flowers which are found in the most liberal profusion on these extensive and untrodden wilds. The naturalist would here meet with abundance of materials for his genius to arrange, while the poet, reminded of his elegies, would perceive how many a flower is born to blush unseen, and waste its sweetness on the desert air. In contrast, the hues of the flowers grown in America with those in England, I must acknowledge that the former country presents the more splendid, but if they are superior in color, they are much inferior in odor. Perhaps the superabundance of light and heat which produces such fine color is prejudicial to the production of odoriferous plants, as anything at all approaching the fragrance of the honeysuckle or sweetbriar I never witnessed in America. In the woody districts, the trees most commonly met with are the oak, hickory, walnut, and sugar maple, besides a great deal of underwood and wild fruit trees of the plum family. As all these grow in a wild state, it is not to be supposed that trees are as numerous as they are in the plantations of this country. The strong timber trees grow at various distances from each other, sometimes being as near to each other as they can possibly grow, at others 20 or 30 yards apart. They not only vary considerably in this respect, but also in magnitude and age. Not a few are to be found in the last stage of decay, their patriarchal dignity gradually submitting to the all-subduing influence of time. Numbers more are quite hollow, in which bees, owls, and rabbits severally find shelter and propagate their species. Everything here bears the mark of ancient, undisturbed repose. The golden age still appears, and when the woodman with his axe enters these territories for the first time, he cannot resist the impression that he is about to commit a trespass on the virgin loveliness of nature, that he is going to bring into captivity what has been free for centuries. In resuming the thread of my narrative, I have to state that as soon as we had sown our Indian corn and planted a few potatoes, we began to prepare for taking in more land, although we had 4 or 5 acres unsown of that which Mr. Oakes had broken up. We hoped, nevertheless, that before another season we should be able to plow and sow in a regular manner. Accordingly, my husband worked very hard every day with his grubbing hoe and axe, tearing up the roots of the underwood and cutting down some of the largest trees. When trees are cut down in America, as little regard is paid to the timber. They do not cut them off level with the ground as in England, but about 3 feet from it. The remaining part is burnt after it has been exposed to the sun's rays a few months. Many trees, however, are allowed to remain standing after the bark has been cut, to cause them to die. In this state they remain even after the land is sown, for being destitute of foliage, they do no harm to the crop. While my husband was thus engaged, I frequently went to him, and, assisted by our little boy, gathered the most portable pieces of brushwood and took them to our cabin to be ready for fuel. Thus, by continued exertions, we had cleared 3 or 4 acres by the end of May, and made a fence half round the piece we intended to enclose as our next field, consisting of about 8 acres. Before this time our old mare had foaled, and, as we partly expected, only survived that event a few weeks. Near our house there is a sort of rivulet, termed in Illinois a branch, in which one Sunday evening, after we had walked 10 miles in going to and from the chapel, we found her laid. We got her out with the help of a rope, and after a while she appeared little worse. A week or 2 afterwards, however, her foal came up by itself, neighing to our door. We were immediately assured that something had befallen its mother, and set out in search of her, whither the foal, going before, led us naturally, as if it had been endowed with reason. She had again fallen into the branch, and was quite dead. The foal, notwithstanding its loss, throve very well, and subsequently became a very valuable broodmare. In the month of June, notwithstanding our economy, we were obliged to purchase some meal on credit. Mr. Varley, the storekeeper, very willingly allowed us to have as much as we wanted, and indeed offered to sell us anything else on the same terms. His miller, however, as soon as he knew we were not giving ready money, only partly filled the bushel, thereby making it dearer to us than before, and we dared not complain to his master for fear that he would refuse it altogether. The debt we contracted was very small, not $1, for which we had bread for the family not less than 6 weeks, the expiration of which brings us to the end of our first wheat harvest, a season conspicuous in my history on account of the severe trials I then experienced. End of chapter 4, part 2.